All right, so in this video, we're going to wrap up our quick discussion of the revolutions of 1848, and we're going to look at the Germanies in 1848. So Austria, Prussia, and the other little Germanies. Or I guess we could have labeled these guys the German Confederation. Although the German Confederation isn't going to be lasting for very much longer. So Austria, Prussia, and the little Germanies. So when we last left off in 1848, Louis Philippe had just abdicated. Nope, abdicated. So he abdicated on February 24th, 1848. And the news of this traveled really quickly. And it soon reached Vienna, the capital of Austria. And Metternich's home base, which makes it the home base of conservatism. So Austria was not immune to the problems that were happening in France. So all of those same social and economic and political problems were happening in Austria just as they were happening in France. So if we think about the social stuff, we still see this gap between rich and poor. We've still got the same issues with industrialization. Although Austria is a little behind. At this point. Economically, the potato famine is hitting Austria just as it hit France, just as it hit everyone in Northern Europe. So all of that stuff that we talked about in the first video on 1848 applies here as well. And politically, even in the home of conservatism, Austrian liberals are frustrated that they have no voice. Like, they don't have any voice. The French liberals had some voice, The Austrian liberals have no voice. Metternich wanted to give them some say, some voice, but that was kind of discounted. And so there's really no outlet for any sort of political discussion. So the same frustration is boiling up in Austria just as it boiled up in France. And Louis Philippe's abdication is a signal, albeit a signal that no one planned for, to start doing stuff. So, on March 10th, 1848, we get a rebellion that looks just like the one in France. We get the poor workers joined by, in this case, college students, who we've mentioned before when we talked about Marx, that they were very similar to the poor workers. They were just as poor, they were just as hungry, they had the same problems finding jobs as the poor workers did, so they had a lot in common. So the poor workers and the college students build the barricades. And they demanded Metternich's resignation. They knew he was the one behind all of this stuff, and they wanted him gone. And the rebellion went on for about 2 weeks, and finally, when it looked like the barricades weren't going anywhere, they were standing firm, finally, Metternich resigns 2 weeks later. So on March 23rd, 1848. So within a month, we get 2 bombshell resignations. Louis Philippe is gone on the 24th of February. Metternich is gone just about a month later. These revolutions happened really, really fast. And that was one of the reasons why initially they were very successful. The conservatives couldn't plan for this stuff. For these spontaneous revolts. Because it seemed like for a long time, everything was on lockdown. It seemed like the conservatives were keeping everything locked up. But eventually, there was enough pressure building up that even with the conservative lockdowns, the voices of the people were heard anyway. And remember that this was something that Metternich wanted to prevent. Remember, he wanted to keep safety release valves, pressure release valves into the system to keep this stuff from happening. But those plans were always secondary to the restrictions, to the rules. And so, because there was no way for the people to let their voices be heard in any way, we get this, we get a revolution. Now, with Metternich gone, who, by the way, had been on the job for almost 40 years at this point. With Metternich gone, liberals across the Little Germanies begin planning. It's like, we've never been able to do this before, and let's start doing this. Let's do liberal stuff. And almost immediately, the King of Prussia runs away. Like, he doesn't want to become a victim of liberal revolution. So he bolts. Like, he's still around, but he leaves Berlin. So he doesn't want to have to resign like Louis Philippe did, or be arrested and executed like Louis XVI. So he kind of runs and hides. Until everything dies down. So he goes to one of his country homes and just waits it out. The liberals from all of the little Germanies, so there's about 40 little Germanies at this point, meet in the city of Frankfurt. And this is called the Frankfurt Parliament. Now, just like we saw in France, both in 1848 and in the dual revolts of 1830 and 1832, once the common foe is gone, all the different groups start to fight each other. And so in the Frankfurt Parliament, there were different kinds of liberals, there were some socialists, there were some radicals, and they all start fighting over petty stuff. And while they're all fighting each other, the conservatives in Prussia and Austria regroup. And they are aided by the Russian army. Because the Russians look at what's been happening all across Europe in 1848, and they don't like this one bit. So the conservatives, the Prussian conservatives, the Austrian conservatives, and the Russians start picking off little Germany's one by one and reasserting conservative rule. Now, the liberals make one last stand. They say the only hope for liberalism can survive in Germany if we unite. So this is one of the first attempts to unite Germany. And so they make one last desperate stand. They say, look, we can survive, liberalism can survive if we unite. And there's only one person who could unite all of us. Under the King of Prussia. The Austrians would have nothing to do with this, but the Prussians always challenged the Austrians for leadership of the German Confederation, and everybody could get behind the Prussians if the King of Prussia would agree to run a new German thing. Whatever we would call it, we can work that out later. But the King of Prussia would have to agree. And he refuses. And he refuses in a very harsh way. He refuses. He says he won't take a crown from the gutter. He's being given this crown by the people. He believes that he gets his power from God. And so he says he won't take a crown from the gutter because he still believes in the divine right of kings. And he won't accept the people giving him power. So he refuses. And the Frankfurt Parliament is forcibly dissolved by the middle of 1849. So again, we see the same basic pattern. Everybody comes together because they all have a common enemy. The common enemy was Metternich. But once they got rid of the common enemy, they all start fighting each other over petty garbage. And that allows the conservatives to regroup. And that's the end of the revolution in the Germanies. Now, as we've said previously, this is also happening in Italy. This is also happening in Hungary. It's also happening in Bohemia. There's a pretty big uprising in Prague. But this is a pretty good example, what happened in France and what happens in the Germanies, of what you see all over. Now, we will pop back to Italy and we will pop back to Hungary when those areas become important to the overall story again. But this kind of highlights the general trend of 1848. Now, there are two, I guess we'll call them epilogues to this. The first one is that while the revolutions themselves failed, there was progress. So we get universal manhood suffrage. In France, they abolish serfdom. in Austria. They get a constitution in Prussia. Begrudgingly, he begrudgingly accepts a constitution. But these are relatively small victories compared to the lofty goals they started with. And it's not going to be for a while until these ideas come back. So it won't be until German unification in 1871 or after World War I in 1918 for these ideas to make a comeback. The other epilogue, the other point that we need to make, and this is going to be a pretty big turning point in terms of our understanding of what happens in this time period, is that this ends the concert of Europe. With Metternich gone, there's no more puppet master. There's nobody pulling the strings. So, like, when the Pope was taken out in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia, there's no more referee. No one is calling the shots anymore. So Europe is going to get a lot more chaotic. So there's going to be more wars. And we've also now unleashed nationalism. Nope, let's actually spell nationalism right. So we've unleashed nationalism. One of the goals that Metternich put out was to squash this. And now he's gone. Now, they had an opportunity to, I guess, harness this, maybe like the Americans had. But instead, they suppressed it. And now it's just out there, and it's kind of destructive. But those who understand it and can use it will be Europe's next set of superstars. And so these are the guys that are going to put Italy together. They're going to put Germany together. They're going to create Austria-Hungary. So the next set of super important European leaders are the ones who can finally get a handle on how to use nationalism. The secret to nationalism is not suppressing it. The secret to using nationalism is to harness it and use it for a goal. That's not necessarily a good thing, but at least it's not running rampant with no control over it. So this is the end of our stuff on the political effects of industrialization. And we'll come back in our next set of videos by talking about the use of political nationalism. So we're going to talk about the Crimean War and German and Italian unification, the creation of Austria-Hungary, and all of that stuff is leading up to World War I. So now we're kind of on the path to World War I, and we'll start doing that road in our next set of videos. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.